All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Uh, I'm very happy and honored to open this collaboration between IberICOnnect and the Israeli chapter of ICONS on the constitutional crisis and judicial overhaul in Mexico. We've seen yesterday that the Mexican president signed the contested reform or law that would change the way judges in Mexico are elected. And we've all seen the protests, the major protests around the country. And in order to better understand what we're talking about, we've assembled some of the great experts on Mexican constitutional law to explain to us what has been going on, what are the implications, what are the challenges, can this so-called reform be challenged, etc. I will introduce the participants in a second, but let me maybe say before that, or maybe ask, why the Israeli section? Why is this a collaboration between if you could just mute everyone. Great, thank you. So let me maybe explain in 30 seconds why the Israeli section, why we have asked to hold this event. First, because we think it's super important to our community and to the ICONS community, and we think that we constitutional scholars should better understand what's going on and stand together with our colleagues in Mexico. But more than that, we Israelis can, I think, in a way relate to some of the debates that have been going on in the last few days in Mexico. Just last year, in 2023, our government has proposed so-called judicial reform or reform in the judicial system that we have regarded something much more revolutionary, a judicial overhaul that would completely transform our constitutional order. And thanks to the major protests that were in Israel, major parts of this reform were blocked. Some were enacted, and the Israeli Supreme Court this January, for the first time in its history, invalidated a constitutional amendment that it considered to be unconstitutional for harming the core values of the state. So this is why we're interested about what's going on. We're here to support you and to learn more. And without further ado, let me just introduce the participants in this event. First, I will pass the floor to Professor Ana Micaela Alterio from Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de Mexico, the Faculty of Law. And then we would have a panel with three wonderful friends and experts, Professor Cisca Pu Jiménez, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, Instituto de Investigación Jurídicas. I apologize for butchering the language. We would have Dr. Mariana Velasco Rivera, Assistant Professor in Law from the School of Law and Criminology, Maynooth University, and Professor Jaime Olaiz Gonzalez from Universidad Panamericana Law School. Then we would have a discussion that my co-chair at ICON-SIL, Professor Tamara Ostowski-Brandes from the Faculty of Law at Ono Academic College, will lead. Let's start with Ana Micaela Alterio. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning for me and for those who are in the mornings. And thank you very much, Janif, for organizing this roundtable, and to the ICONS Israel chapter for the interest in the judicial overhaul in Mexico. I want to begin this discussion with a brief introduction to what is happening in Mexico and what I consider to be the key to understanding it. The Mexican Constitution, dating back to 1917, has undergone nearly 800 reforms to its articles. Article 135 outlines the procedure for constitutional amendments, requiring the approval of 2/3 of each house of Congress and more than half of the legislative assemblies of the states. This process lacks instances of political participation and cooling off clauses and can be initiated by the executive branch. Despite the seemingly rigid requirements, due to the hyper-presidential system in Mexico and the verticality of the party system, the president controls the member of his party both in Congress and in the states, and it is easy for him to generate alliances to carry out reforms. This has allowed each president of Mexico to carry out the constitutional reform he has wanted, generating a constitution that doesn't have a clear identity, is one of the longest in the world, and is full of contradictions. In this sense, it can be said that Mexico doesn't have a system with constitutional supremacy, since the Constitution hasn't served as an effective limit on power, but rather as the recipient of each 6-year political program. Added to this is the fact that the Supreme Court of Justice has not developed a doctrine of unconstitutional constitutional amendments, neither formally nor materially, a possibility that was also expressly denied with the 2013 reform of the Amparo Law. This design gives us the key to understanding why the judicial overhaul has been possible at a time when Morena, the party of Andrés Manuel López Obrador and the future President Claudia Sheinbaum, have supermajorities in Congress and govern more than half of the state of the Republic. Now, what does the judicial overhaul consist of? Although the presidential rhetoric has been to democratize such power and clean it up, making it more independent, more legitimate, and less corrupt, the truth is that nothing of the reform goes in that direction, quite the contrary. The amendment doesn't touch the current justice system in Mexico, which is integrated not only by the judiciary, but also by the prosecutor's offices, the police, the National Guard, and the armed forces, which, it is worth mentioning, has many of the defects that the president pointed out: high impunity rates, lack of access to the most vulnerable people, corruption, etc. The only thing that is reformed is the mechanism of access and permanence of judges, magistrates, and ministers, making it more accessible through popular vote. With this, it will replace the totality of the holders of the federal judiciary, that are more or less 1,700 positions, and all those of the 33 local judiciaries. As to how judges will be selected, the fact that they will be elected by popular vote is a half-true. Before the vote, there is a selection process for those who will
Michaela?
and the Supreme.
Is it just me that
I'm sorry. Did you hear me?
we've lost you for a few seconds?
Okay. I was in the process of nomination. Did you hear that? I'm sorry.
Just repeat the last 3 sentences.
Okay. So I was in the process of pre-selection before the ballot. You know, there is a evaluation committee, and then once the selection for the evaluation committee has been made, the nomination of the candidate is in the hands of the 3 branches of government. Thus, the executive branch will nominate 1/3 of the candidates, the legislative branch another 1/3, and the Supreme Court the remaining 1/3. This, from the outset, guarantees Morena the nomination of 2/3 of the future incumbent, so that the election remains in the background. It is also worth noting that between 6 and 10 persons, people, depending on the position, are expected to be nominated for each vacancy to be filled, which means a ballot with thousands of people for the citizens to vote on, who will hardly have the tools to make the decision. And the last note that I would like to highlight, to leave room for the comments of my colleague, is that the reform established a disciplinary court whose function will be to control the good performance of the judiciary. Therefore, when the judges and magistrates are appointed, they will be subject to the control and an appealable sanction of this court, which threatens the independence they may have in their work. A work which, it should be noted, has a duration of 9 years with the possibility of re-election, which has another incentive to be differential to the political power. In short, the reform of the judiciary is majoritarian, but not democratic, undermines judicial independence, disregards the professionalization of the function, breaks with the division of power and the possibility of control over political power, and opens many loopholes to suspect that it will lead to greater corruption and less efficiency in the administration of justice. This is not only serious, but also inaugurates a new regime for the Mexican state, the consequences of which are still difficult to foresee. And with this, I would love to give the floor to Francisca Pou Jimenez. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Micaela, for a great summary of the different points that are on the table. And I will expand on some of them, but maybe the first thing I would like to underline is that this is not something that comes out of the blue, and it's not an isolated thing. It's part of a pattern that has been going on for 6 years. Right? And we can then describe later on more specifically what has been happening. How is it that we got here, right? But I would like to say that the judicial reform that was published yesterday, I would like to be able to say that this is the final blow, the grand finale of López Obrador. But not, because there are unfortunately other constitutional amendments in line that will be passed these following days and weeks, adding then additional chapters in this chain of events that has been unfolding over the last 6 years. The judicial reform is part of a package of 18 reforms, some of them statutory and some of them constitutional, that López Obrador submitted to Congress on February the 5th of this year, of 2024. This package includes the judicial reform, like published yesterday, but also the elimination of several independent agencies. This is important because independent agencies in Mexico have constitutional status, and most of the powers they have were detracted from the president, from the executive. So these independent agencies are part of the horizontal division of powers and were one mechanisms to deconcentrate, to take power away from the president. So now the reform eliminates the transparency agency that has been extraordinarily weakened by López Obrador and the 2 antitrust agencies. And then we have the electoral reform that places, the electoral organization of elections under a body that will also be elected by popular vote, etc. And then we have the reform that will place the National Guard under full military control. That has been, also one of the obsessions of López Obrador over these last months. So about the judicial reform, the one we have today, in the official gazette, finally published, it is important to remember what the reform does not. This is important because of the manipulation of public debate, on the manipulation of López Obrador around all this. It's been, I think, one of the most painful things over the last weeks has been to see how the reform was presented to the people as the magic solution to the problems that exist. And of course, there are problems that exist. We are constitutional scholars. We've been, writing papers all these decades, pointing out the problems that had to be, improved in the Mexican system. But The fact is that nothing in the content of the reform addresses any of them. And of course, it creates new ones that will be fatal for, as Micaela said, independence, professionalism, democracy, and peace in the country. But this post-truth kind of locura has been really painful for us because people, of course, López Obrador is a populist magician, but of course, people is receptive to the lies about the content of the reform. Because in Mexico, the judiciary has not a lot of accumulated social legitimacy because, because of problems of access to justice, because, ironically, it hasn't been a judiciary as activist as other in Latin America, so people really does not notice, how important is the functions that the judiciary display in the Mexican democracy because of these problems, because of the prosecutorial offices, because of the way the police works, etc. All the problems that this reform does not touch. About the contents, expanding on what Micaela said, I want you to see how radical the reform is, right? Because in Bolivia, you have this popular vote only for the apex courts, for the highest courts in the country, which is, something that we can just from university citizenry, public opinion, it has worked very badly, but it's kind of more manageable. This is the entire Mexican judiciary, the state judiciary, the federal judiciary, the Supreme Court, the electoral court, the new disciplinary court. The only courts that are not touched by the reform are the land courts, the bureaucratic courts, and the military courts, those that are already under the sphere of the executive. And the other point that why this is very radical is that it's not a gradual replacement. These autocratic populists in Europe have been, for instance, lowering the retirement age of judges, and kind of slowly putting the candidates they want in the judiciary. No, this is a total dismissal in 2 batches. In June of next year and in 2027. And then all this craziness about the lists, right? That Micaela said. I mean, there will be these selection committees that we don't know whose members will be. The minimal requirements are really very minimal because you must have a law degree, and in Mexico, there's no regulation of the law schools. So this means that you really can get a law degree like in 2 years with it is the most disorganized thing in the world. Then they put in the Constitution all these details. We will be speaking of hyper-reformism before my colleagues will be speaking about that. Now you have in the Constitution that the people must have a degree, an average of 8 points in the subjects like having to do with the functions, and present a 3-page essay about why they want to be judges, and the letters of 5 neighbors saying, that they are like nice people to be a judge. But other than that, we don't know. And the thing is that the parties will control. And if there's the Constitution says that if there's more candidates than posts that you can elevate as a power branch to the list, then that will be a draw, a lottery. All this is important because you have to be in the position of the people that wants to be a judge in this country, undergoing, being prepared to undergo all these things. And then of course, these lists will be, ordered by power branches, and it is really expectable that people will somehow write down will be those promoted by the executive. Think that, for instance, in Mexico City, if you count the posts that might be filled, we have to have in the ballot more than 1,000 names. How will this be, this ballot with more than 1,000 names that will mean nothing to people? I mean, even in logistic terms, the National Electoral Institute has said to the government, how are we supposed to organize this and how this will be paid? So the response of the government is that it will be paid by the trusts that they are eliminating. The money that the judiciary had for pensions of the judges and etc. are eliminated by the reform. So they say all this pile of money will be allocated to the really high cost that all this system will have. Then you have the electoral campaign things. You know, the candidates to be a judge must run an electoral campaign. There's no money allotted to the campaign, but there are, you know, posts on the TV and on radio. There's no regulation of social media. And of course, the question is how this will escape the control that organized crime has in Mexico over all elections. But in the municipal elections, this has been, I don't know if you have seen the numbers of murders, of political violence, of candidates murdering. It's been, we live in a Hobbesian situation in Mexico. So just imagine these campaigns and just imagine, or just ask yourself where the money will come from and how this can be possibly something good. Then another difference, the judiciary will not be an option for life. The judges will be there only 9 years. So this is a big change also from the model of judicial career, where, you know, this is a life option, you will be there. Now the judges will be elected for 9 years and they can be re-elected if they go through again all these things. Another detail, they have created the faceless judges, jueces sin rostro. I don't know if you are familiar with this figure that the Inter-American Court has said that is contrary to guarantees, because of course, you cannot guarantee, you don't know what is a faceless judge. You don't have the guarantee that you are judged by an independent judge. So in the end, they also introduced this figure used by Fujimorismo, used by, you know, the worst political like kind of reactions in Latin America. So it is also there. And then the disciplinary court thing, the Judiciary Council disappears. And as Micaela has said, they create this disciplinary court that will be elected by popular vote as well, 5 members elected for 6 years. And there are many problematic features in the design of this disciplinary court. But for instance, the court will be able to act on any denunciation by any authority or any citizen at any moment. So okay, 10 minutes. So one thing is that you have this open legitimation that will activate the disciplinary court at any moment, you know? The second is that the hypotheses that it can that can activate the proceedings against the judges are described very, very broadly. Most whatever can fit into these descriptions. And it can investigate the judges, it can sanction them, it can inhabilitate them, it can notify the prosecutor and notify the chambers to the effects of impeachment. And 1 year after the election, the disciplinary court will have an ex officio revision of the elected courts. So this is, I will stop because we can continue afterwards, but as you can imagine, this will be horrible for almost all the vectors of normativity that are of interest when it turns to the operation of a judiciary. Independence, professional capacity, you know, the sheer capacity to give certainty to at least some parts of the legal system. Corruption, I mean, all the problems we have will be deepened and expanded, and new problems, of course, not only for democracy, for the people, for democracy, for everything, for the rule of law, will really likely be generated by this reform. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chisca. And now I will give the floor to Mariana Velasco Rivera. Mariana, when the time is out, I will do it like this. Okay, thank you.
I can also set a timer. Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you to the organizers for having me, and also thank you to the audience for their interest in learning more about what's going on in Mexico. I'm really looking forward to the discussion afterwards. So given the gravity of what is happening and will continue to happen in Mexico, as Chisca very really summarized really well, I think it's important for the audience to know what we're seeing, what we're seeing, it didn't happen in a vacuum. So I want to use my time to offer an account or to complement also Micaela's account. So to give, like a larger context in which, the larger context in which the present crisis is inserted. So I think giving such an account is important because the crisis is in my view, the result of a shared responsibility of, on the one hand, the political elite as a whole, that is to say, political parties across the political spectrum, and two, to an important extent, it's also a shared responsibility of the Supreme Court, in particular, the traditional understanding of the scope and limits of the amendment power. So let me start with the shared responsibility of the political elite. So the first thing that one has to know is that, as Micaela already suggested, on paper, just as the US Constitution, the Mexican Constitution is supposed to be a rigid one. In fact, as you may already know, the Mexican rule of amendment is very similar to that of the US. It requires 2/3 of each of the chambers of the bicameral Congress and the ratification of 32 of half of the 32 state legislatures. The second thing that one has to know is that since 1988, no party has had the constitutionally required qualified majorities to amend the Constitution on its own. And yet, the Mexican Constitution is one of the most amended in the world. So how is that possible? You might be asking yourself. Well, this is what brings us to the point of the shared responsibility of the political elite. I have argued in other places that in the context of Mexico's transition to democracy, an unwritten rule of cooperation across party lines that enables the access to the amendment mechanism for political entrenchment emerged in the 90s and consolidated in the decade that followed. In line with what studies of judicialization of politics tell us, in the 90s, the debilitated PRI negotiated the amendments that enable the transition to democracy. However, unlike what is assumed by the model of judicialization of politics, which is a stable constitutional text equals powerful apex courts due to their interpretation power, political parties in Mexico continue to make use of constitutional amendments for political entrenchment from the transition to democracy to our days. So how, you might be asking yourself? So the answer would be by abiding by the rule of cooperation that emerged when the amendments that facilitated the transition to democracy were negotiated. The conditions in that moment were ripe for the consolidation of the rule of cooperation for at least one reason, and that is that when it comes to constitutional amendments, the PRI, so the former hegemonic party, retained important leverage for the adoption of amendments. Even though out of power at the federal level, the PRI did not lose its local strongholds until 2015, which meant that they could potentially reject amendments by the state at the state legislature level. Therefore, from 2000 to 2012, the party in government, that is in this case the PAN, wanted to bring, if the party in government wanted to bring any amendment forward, the incentives were strong to cooperate with the PRI. The rule of cooperation works thanks to mainly two factors: a very high de facto centralization of decision-making within the political parties, and two, very strong party discipline. As a result, the way in which formal constitutional change in Mexico operates has suffered from a procedural and a substantive perspective. From procedural speaking, constitutional amendments are overwhelmingly passed through fast-track processes that lack considered and thorough debates and analysis. That is, what we saw in the last few days, and you might be familiar with, in terms of the speed of the process, which basically the constitutional hurdles were cleared in just a few days, this might sound like an extraordinary situation or unseen situation or unprecedented situation to the external observer, right? But it is not. These practices were normalized long ago by today's oppositions. And then, substantively speaking, the constitutional change, formal constitutional change in Mexico has suffered And in that, so just to be clear, the judicial overhaul is probably the most abusive constitutional amendment in Mexico's contemporary constitutional history. However, substantively, these practices have been like abusive practices have been normalized already, like historically. So the instrumentalization of constitutional amendments have long been part of constitutional amendment culture in Mexico. There are helpful examples across, like in the last 3 decades, just to mention two, in 2000, as early as 2005, before the ratification of the Rome Statute, a constitutional amendment was adopted to conditionally accept the jurisdiction of the ICC, which, as you may know, it's not allowed by the Rome Statute. Another example is the amendment that in 2011 stripped the Supreme Court away from its jurisdiction to investigate grave human rights violation, something that had helped shedding light on grave human rights violations by the PRI and PAN governors, one of whom later became president of Mexico. So this is just like to mention two examples, but against this backdrop, I hope that I'm able to shed light on the idea that what is a very concerning constitutional democracy crisis that Mexico is experiencing at the moment is a result of a culture of amendment that has been long in the making, and as such, at least to some extent, there is a shared responsibility by the political elite that has ruled since the 90s. So now, just very quickly, let me move briefly to my second point, which is the responsibility of the Supreme Court. As external observers, you might be thinking, well, surely the Supreme Court in some way could stop this, right? I understand that Jaime will analyze this question in more detail, but let me just briefly explain to you why I think the Supreme Court also bears responsibility for this mess. In short, the reason is that the Supreme Court has traditionally understood the amendment power as an unlimited power, not subject to any kind of scrutiny. So as such, the Supreme Court has gone as far as saying that not even violations to the process of adoption would be subject to review. So this, in my view, has fed into the belief of the party in government, Morena, and the political elite in general, that as long as the party or a coalition holds the needed majorities to amend the Constitution, nothing is off the table. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mariana. And now, Jaime Olaiz, please.
Thank you, Micaela. First of all, I would like to thank Janif, Tamara, and Micaela for putting this symposium together in this very concerning hour for Mexico, and not from the constitutional law perspective, but overall as our viability as a nation based on the rule of law and the respect of human rights. I am very happy to share this panel with my dear Chisca and Mariana as well. And I would like to use the remainder of the time of this first part of our conversation to try to put things as in a very unconventional approach, meaning that this is not a constitutional amendment, but rather this is a constitutional replacement. We are in face of an unprecedented attempt to destroy the basic structure, not only of the Constitution, but of the political system itself in Mexico, as was designed not only in 1917, but in our first constitutional project in 1824, that was based on 3 branches of government based on checks and balances. This is completely or utterly eradicated with this reform. And I would like to frame my argument with what Mariana was saying at the end of her presentation, which is there was a constitutional consensus in our process of political liberalization in the 1990s. And that consensus was based on 3 main things: an independent electoral authority that will organize and qualify elections, an independent Supreme Court with effective powers to control not only separation of powers, but to undergo actual judicial review, and third, an overall or comprehensive protection of human rights that was actually rubricated with the constitutional amendment of 2011. I think those three great transformations of the last 30 years constitute what was intended to be erased or destroyed with this amendment that was passed last week. And what is the problem of this? That in this perspective, the court has not done, sadly, its work, and we are very ill-equipped to address a constitutional crisis of this magnitude. So we are clearly in face of a limit situation of extraordinary nature that by definition requires extraordinary measures. The problem is that the enduring formalistic or dogmatic tradition or approach of the court not to address the validity, procedurally or substantively speaking, of constitutional amendments has created a pretty large margin to enable constitutional abuse from majoritarian governing coalitions as we are seeing at the moment. However, we are trying as legal community to challenge this situation by a sort of manifold strategies. On the one hand, there is the legal front. On the legal front, I think that the central question is if a constitutional amendment of this nature constitutes a breakdown of our constitutional order and therefore should be revised by the Supreme Court as a last resort of the constitutional order. And in that case, I think the court, first of all, should not treat it as a constitutional amendment, but rather as a replacement. And as you know, there is a vast experience and a vast doctrine and jurisprudence from the comparative constitutional perspective that illustrates the interplay that these type of cases entail. So in that sense, I think the court at the moment has two approaches: either to treat it as a constitutional amendment and therefore be willing to revise the procedural flaws that evidently took place, but that would be, I would say, the prudent approach in which the court will kind of exercise a sort of self-restraint, because even if it chooses to follow that path, it will go against its own precedent, as Mariana was saying, because they underscore that as a constituted power, they are not able to review the decisions of the reformative power of the Constitution. The other approach, which will be more adamant, but I think under these circumstances is necessary, is to approach this not as an amendment, but as a replacement, and tackle the inadequacy, the violation of the Constitution itself by implementing an amendment that blows not only separation of powers, but the protection of fundamental rights. And that is, let's say, the expected action from the court. There has been a growing opinion of some members of the court at the moment that they are willing, apparently, to address in either of these two approaches the constitutional amendment that took place last week. At the same time, and as you know, there are two alternatives to put in motion this defense. One is through controversia constitucional, that will be filed by a state against the amendment. Unfortunately, acción de inconstitucionalidad is, I see Chisca reacting. It's a paradox, you know, because acción de inconstitucional was designed to protect political minorities. But with this landslide result from the election in June, political minorities in Congress didn't even reach the third necessary to file acción de inconstitucional. So that's unfortunate, and I think that criterion of protecting the rights of political minorities should be revised, because either they have the 33% or less, they still being political minorities and they shouldn't be defenseless. But that's a discussion for another time, if we survive, of course. But the point is that controversia constitucional, and there will be, I would say, a staggering number of amparos against the amendment. The problem is that in light of some amendments that were made to the law of amparo, and also this amendment, the effects of for those amparos are not general any longer. So that is also problematic for implementation. The other front is continuous social mobilization. As you know, there is an unprecedented mobilization, mainly of judiciary officials all around the country that are directly affected by the implementation of this amendment. And also they have been joined by students of higher education around the country as well. And it seems that the movement will not cease. So this mobilization, we expect that will continue and will endure. And thirdly, and this is a great illustration of that, is the support from colleagues from abroad that we greatly appreciate. We are overwhelmed by this support, Yaniv and Tamara, and thank you for it. And I think with the combination of these strategies will at the end will result in the court to feel more, I would say, more incentive to undertake an analysis that is not only unprecedented but extremely risky under the present situation, because it is clearly a problem of legitimacy. Either approach it will choose to do. But the thing is that I used to say in other contexts that the powers of the court to revise constitutional amendments based on the basic structure doctrine is a kind of a break in case of an emergency. And in this case, it is without any doubt the greatest emergency that we are facing. And I will stop there, but the bottom line or the punchline is really this was not in the ballot. This is an abuse of power, as they want to portray it as a mandate of the people. This was not a mandate of the people. Second, they are not the constituent power. They also, part of the official narrative is that they are trying to equal their majority with as a constituent power. And third, as I said at the beginning, not an amendment, but a replacement, and we should start by calling things by their name. I will stop there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now I think Tamara Hotovsky, I'm sorry, will make some comments. Tamara?
Yes, no, I'm just going to be very brief because I want to leave actually time for Q&A and for discussion. But I actually want to repeat what Yaniv said when we just opened, which is that everything that you're saying hits very close to home. I mean, that's why we initiated this joint webinar to begin with. And now that we've heard you, I think this is even more so. It kind of brings back memories you know, from the past almost 2 years, 2 years in Israel, both with respect to how the reform and the changes is presented to the public, you know, the manipulation of public opinion that relies on real problem but doesn't solve them. The dramatic changes that are presented really as something else. But also, I think what is strikingly similar here is that we, the legal community in Israel, very much relied on comparative, you know, constitutional law and on comparative knowledge and on interactions with colleagues from abroad to bring back into Israel, into the Israeli public discussions, you know, examples and case studies and arguments that kind of illustrated, you know, to the Israeli public that what we're saying is going on is really what is going on, because look, it's the same pattern that has happened in Hungary, it's the same pattern that has happened in Poland. And I think that, you know, the comparative aspect, actually the comparative arguments have been instrumental in the ability of Israeli scholars to convince and to educate both the public here and, you know, the legal community here. I think they played a key role. So obviously, you know, if we can engage in that kind of interaction and give back, you know, what we received from the international community, I think from our comparative constitutional law community, I think it would be great. And obviously, you know, I'm myself curious to hear of how, you know, how do you what are the odds, do you think, you know, that the strategies you're working on or the tactics you're aiming at will actually work? To what extent, you know, do you think that there needs to be synergy here between public opinion and support from the legal community and the court, which I think in Israel played a very important role, you know, that the court knew that had popular, that the public was backing it in its decision, in invalidating the unreasonableness amendment. But I don't want you to answer me now because I do want to open the floor for a question. And I think the most efficient way to do so would actually be if people would raise their hands. I'm only calling you by first names because that way I won't get anyone. The odds of me getting names wrong are smaller. And also we can move forward. And I suggest that people will raise their hands on the Zoom and we'll let 2 or 3 people, you know, ask questions, collect questions, and then you can answer and we can do a few rounds. And Yaniv, I see that you want to start.
Just until people feel comfortable to raise their hands, I said I'll start just rolling the ball here. I have a comment and a question, and later on you can answer the question. So the comment is about the legitimacy of the court. Cisco mentioned that the lack of perhaps of legitimacy that the court has, and I want to give the counter argument in support of court's involvement in this case. And the court here is in a dilemma, right? If the court intervenes in this super political issue, then it might lose some legitimacy. But in contrast, I want to argue, if the court intervenes and strikes down this dismemberment or this constitutional replacement, then sorry, I'll repeat. If the court intervenes and strikes it down, it might lose some of its legitimacy. However, if the court does not intervene, then anyway, it would lose both its independence and its legitimacy. Okay, so I think at least when it comes to legitimacy accounts, the court must intervene. And my question, maybe to Mariana, is how do I explain to my colleagues here in Israel or to the larger public the lack of rigidity? Because people are saying, what? It passed the 2/3 and then it was ratified locally. It passed all these bars. Then how come this does not represent the will of...
café.
Sorry, Jose Mario, if you could mute yourself. So how do you explain, if it passed all these hurdles, how come it doesn't represent the will of the people? This is the question I have.
Anyone else wants to raise their hands, or are we starting with Yaniv's question?
Recording in progress.
Okay, I don't see any other hands raised at this point.
I can try to answer Yaniv's question if that's okay. Yeah, so thank you, Yaniv. I mean, first to answer to the specific question you're asking me, so how to explain the lack of rigidity if this like if in theory the Mexican Constitution is a rigid constitution and like has like this stringent process that has to be comply with in order to change it. So I think that the best way to explain it is that we have, so the first thing is that like just by looking at the rule of amendment, we cannot understand like how constitutions change in practice. And that like then the Mexican case actually is a very informative case to show this, especially if we compare it with the US Constitution, right? Because they share this they share very similar rules. And in order to understand the Mexican case, what I would say is that you need to look not only at the rule, but also at the actors that actually are in charge or have the power to activate this rule, which in the case of in the Mexican case and as a general rule are political parties, right? So you need to have these are the actors that have as a general rule the power to activate the amendment mechanism. And so and then once you you shift the attention to those actors, you have to understand that these actors also operate based on certain norms that are basically that form with practice, and we have to have like a good understanding of those practices to be able to understand why in the case of Mexico this is even though we have a rigid constitution on paper, in practice, because we have a very first of all a very centralized de facto political parties are very, very centralized when it comes to decision making. And second of all, there is very strong party discipline. So again, we have sort of like a de facto very strong whip system in Mexico, where party members are vote as they are told, because otherwise they will face consequences say with in respect to their sort of political ambitions. So I think those are the 2 points that I will make to try to explain why the Mexican Constitution is easy to amend in practice.
Great, thank you very much. So we have Isi and Masum, and we had Irene, but maybe your hands is down. So Isi and then Masum, and let's see if there are other people who want to answer.
Thank you very much, everybody, for a fascinating presentations and discussion. And thank you, Yaniv and Tamar, for organizing this. I want to continue Yaniv's question and ask you about to hypothesize what would happen if the Supreme Court decides to strike down this constitutional amendment. So in Israel, we're all the time on the brink of constitutional crisis. So we're all the time hypothesizing what would happen if the Minister of Justice decides not to abide by the Supreme Court decision to do this or that. It hasn't happened yet. And I'm wondering what would happen in Mexico. So what would happen, what would Lopez Obrador do and his political party if the Supreme Court decides to be brave and to strike down the amendment? I know it's a difficult question because you don't know, it never happened, but hypothesize.
Yes, Masum, and then we'll do a round of answers.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone, for today's discussion. I had a question on how the elections will specifically proceed. I would like a little more clarity on that. Maybe Professor Michaela or Professor Francisca can answer this. Will the elections happen in this way? For example, a citizen will elect judges, how we elect members of our own parliamentary constituency, or will a citizen elect judges for the entirety of the nation? So how will that geographical delimitation work? And will sorry, is that someone who's mic? Yes. So, and will the citizens be electing judges for every level of court? And so, how will that work? For example, provincial courts followed by the Supreme Court. So, how will that specifics work? That's my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ori, you wanted to ask a question, and then we'll do a round of answers, maybe?
Yeah, thank you. Quick question. So most of what we hear about the justifications for the reform are of the negative kind, right? We're fixing all the corruption of the existing system. Can you say something about the sort of the positive version of what does the reform promise? I mean, people who support it, what kind of expectations do they present to the population, saying we'll have better outcomes, better results? Saying we'll have better outcomes, better results. So what's kind of the charge?
I can't hear Ori, but I don't know if my internet is wrong.
No, I
No,
think
yeah.
it's his
Froze. I
internet.
couldn't hear you either.
Yeah, he froze. So let's take a round of
sorry.
answers.
Okay.
Okay, we're back.
Oh,
Let's do
sorry.
round of
Okay, so I'll be quick. So to repeat?
Yes.
You can try to.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I was just asking if you can say something about the positive argument for the reform. Most of what we've heard is that the reform is justified by saying we're fixing the current corruption. But what was the sort of argument that presented that would say justice will be done better now that the new system is in place? Thank you.
If
Okay,
you
so who
want,
wants to go first?
I can answer this last question. I think there is a special moment in Mexico, and maybe my colleagues, I don't know if they agree with me in this point specifically, but since the court has changed, that was at 1994 until today, the former president had not had a real I don't know how to say, limit from the court. There, as Mariana said before, there were a lot of amendments, and some of them were very difficult to justify, and the court never put a limit in that way. So this is the first precedent that have a real opposition from the court, or at least he feel that way. So for him, the judiciary represents the conservative power against the willing of the people and the will of
Is it only mine frozen? Is Michaela frozen for you also?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I suggest maybe until Michaela's back, one of you wants to also respond to one of the questions that were asked. Mariana?
Oh, Maria.
No, Chica, go ahead. I already spoke. Go ahead.
Oh,
Okay, I just want to let me out. Michaela is there again.
Oh, sorry. I don't know if you hear me. My internet is bad.
We stopped hearing you when you were saying that the president like feels that the court is its main
Yes,
enemy,
the
so
opposition.
to say. Yeah.
It's like the conservative power in itself, you know. So for the president, the judicial power is putting obstacles of the transformation of the country. And in the better light, you can see that. You can say, okay, the people, well, in the narrative of the president, the judiciary is the elite that is defending the interests of the elite, and if you put people from the bottom, you will have another judiciary, a with more proximity with the people and more progressive and more collaborative. There is the, I saw Eileen Kavanagh before here. It's like the narrative of a collaborative judicial power that is not, of course, with the theory of a collaboration, but in the mind of the president, this is a way to have a collaborative state. This is at least in the better light of what he wants. But the thing is that no part of the reform goes in that direction. Is packing all the judiciary and put in the judiciary persons that can agree with every public policy that is going on. And another point, very briefly. The problem with the doctrine of constitutional amendment now is that the court is in a very difficult situation because it's like judge and part of the conflict, and the court have never used that doctrine, and now that the court itself is in a problem to inaugurate this doctrine, and with the majority, but a huge majority from the part of the president, is very hard to advance this kind of doctrine. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. I want you all to have another round of answering, all of the participants. So who wants to go now?
I can
Okay,
go if you want, because I have some things to complement the answers that have been given. So what Mariana said is very important. You have to understand the political dynamics of the country. But one thing that I would add is that constitutional amendment in Mexico is the big negotiation warehouse of everything. Why? Because of money. You know, in theory, Mexican states, as in the US on the design, they could collect taxes. But decades ago, they decided to renounce the power to collect taxes in favor of the federation. This is called the Coordination Fiscal Pact, El Pacto de Coordinación Fiscal. So, and this arrangement is not in the Constitution. So there are no economic guarantees to federalism. What the states do is let the federation to collect all the money and then negotiate with the federation the money they receive back. And this is a huge problem in Mexico. And this explains hyper-reformism to a good degree, because, you know, if you don't vote in favor of the amendment, you won't receive money. I mean, this is central to understand the dynamics. How is it possible? Well, it is possible because everything is negotiated. The money is negotiated. Another point that has to do with the Yaniv and Avi question. I mean, the Supreme Court has, all options are difficult, but on the top, the Supreme Court is very divided, already very weakened. Right? Because López Obrador has been able to appoint 5 justices. He was supposed to appoint 3. The design, like, you know, the standard thing for a president is to be able to propose 3. But they forced the renunciation of a justice on corruption charges, you know, by early in the term. And then, of course, the former president of the Supreme Court, Arturo Saldívar, that was highly criticized in the country because he was super close to the president, renounced and left an additional post for López Obrador to appoint a 5th justice, right? Of these 5 justices, like not everybody is, 2 of the justices have turned independent, but there are 3 justices that are inconditionals of López Obrador. So I don't know if you saw these videos these days of these justices on the street saying, I was a founder of Morena, you know, the reform shall pass. I mean, they were campaigning in the streets in favor of the reform. So in the Supreme Court, you have like 3 groups. A majoritarian group that is against, but some of them are not very vocal. and the others are vocal, and there are like justice in the middle that don't say much. And then you have the López Obrador representatives in the court, right? So this only makes more difficult to think if the court will decide to separate from his case law, his doctrine, and maybe I agree, Janif, maybe it would be rational because the alternative is nothing. I mean, the alternative, and what will happen? And this, Avi, there is a small weakness in all the design of the election, is that actually, López Obrador, to implement the reform, needs the Supreme Court, the current Supreme Court, to be active, to be operating, because the current Supreme Court needs to present candidates. So this is why they are offering the renunciation of the current justices with full retirement benefits if they don't renounce now. They don't want them to renounce now. They want them to renounce next year after the election, because the design of the system is that part of the candidates come from the Supreme Court. So what happens if the Supreme Court is suddenly without members? You know what I mean? I don't know if it's very clear. So this is curious, because this can be a problem for López Obrador, so maybe this is a strength for the court. Like, there's still a majority. In October, Claudia Sheinbaum will be able to appoint another justice, and then everything will be lost. Yeah, you know what I mean? It's like, but the list, so just to complement this, but I want to emphasize what Jaime said about the complexity of, even if the court wants to review the constitutionality of this constitutional amendment or replacement or whatever, the procedural complexity is big, because abstract review is blocked because there's no parliamentary minority with the legitimation. They are one member below the legitimation. So only amparo is available, and the judges will file amparos. But amparo is an individual complaint. Well, there will be a massive wave of amparos, that's true. But you know how complicated is all this, right? In terms of the legal defense. The social defense, we can speak afterwards. I am more optimistic about that, because among other things, I mean, Morena only understands social mobilization. Legal mobilization is like nothing for them, you know what I mean?
Jaime, I'm turning to you.
Thank you, Tamar. I would like to focus on Easy's question, because I think that is the key question at the moment. And I think that the only plausible way out, if the court decides to strike down the amendment, is a political solution, Easy. First, I think we should wait for the transfer of power in the executive branch to see if this unfolds as we are describing. Perhaps it will water down not only the contents of the amendment itself and allow some room to negotiate or to find some accommodation with the new administration, but at the same time will enable the court to somehow try to save the most important part of the amendment, which is the rest of the federal judiciary. Perhaps that implies the sacrifice of the Supreme Court itself, but in order to protect or to preserve the rest of the federal judiciary. That is problematic, but remember that in this case, in contrast to the case, to the cases that we have studied, either Israel or, as Chisca was mentioning, Bolivia, in this case, they are trying to sack the whole federal judiciary, meaning around 1,600 federal judges. So in that respect, I think that the court would be willing to find some accommodation with the new administration. I think it's worth saying that in the process of the deliberation and approval of this amendment, there were a number of amparos that were filed, and at least 5 injunctions were issued to stop the process, and none was complied either in Congress or by the president by stopping the issuance of the amendment. Therefore, my take on your question is that if we rely on a self-restraint from the governing coalition, we will be extremely disappointed as usual, because they will not show that restraint, and I think collaboration should be expected from other participants, but not the governing coalition. That's it.
Thank you very much, Jaime. So we have Irene waiting to ask a question, and if someone else wants to ask, now is the time, and then I'm going to give you each a round of wrapping, just, think of 1 or 2 things you want to say in addition to answering the questions. So, Irene?
Yeah, thank you so much. So my question is, it's going to differ a bit from the overall topic, but it's mainly about the opposition. So I don't know if for the non-Mexican audience, one of the key takeaways from, it's not in a positive tone, but one of the takeaways from the Senate discussion was that the opposition in Mexico seems to be non-existent, no? Or has been transformed. I don't know how to put it. So my question is very open, and you can answer it in any way you can, is how should the opposition be structured so that the next, now we're not in a good place, no? With the judicial, yeah, that passed. But the thing is, what should we do? Because the next set of reforms that are coming are also as terribly bad. So this is like more a political question rather than a legal question, but I would love to know what your opinion regarding that would be. And also just a small comment, I think that Chisca, your comment regarding Mexico being part of this trend of systems where the democratic backsliding was steady. I think one of the key takeaways also from the Mexican experience is that it suddenly went into warp speed. And that's something that at least I have not seen before, no? That in a matter of days, the whole system went down. Of course, it did not happen in a vacuum, but there is also this component of it went on a uncontrolled decline, no? Which I think is also important to highlight. Thank you.
Okay, so Yaniv, one last short question, and then in the same order that we spoke, let's each have like the final thoughts, final takeaway from this very, very fascinating webinar.
Thank you very much, Tamal. 3 very brief points. The first one is that I want to respond to Michaela's point about it looks like self-dealing. How can the court deal with an amendment that deals with its own powers, right? It is in a conflict of interest here. So I want to say that the court, Miguel, sorry, I'm muting you. So so what I want to say is that I think that actually it is precisely in this area that the court must be extremely militant in its approach and be extremely proactive. And in a recent article, Pablo Castillo Ortiz and I, we called it that this is democratic self-defense. The court must be activist and strike down the amendment, not in order to protect the court or the judiciary, but in order to protect democracy. Because once the court falls, the democratic order will fall. And the question that I want to ask, this was a comment, the question is whether we can somehow rely on a supranational, regional institution to come here to an aid. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So back to the order in which you spoke. Final thoughts for the evening.
Okay, very quickly. Yes, the opposition does not exist, in part because of a controversy that we haven't had time to speak about, which is over-representation. I mean, there was a violation of the limits on parliamentary overrepresentation a few weeks ago. And this is why now all the reforms that are, on the table will be passed. They are one senator below in the Senate, but this guy voted with them, right? So this is on legal terms. On political terms, the opposition is in shambles. The opposition are the students. The opposition are the basis of the judiciary that are on the streets. The oppositions are, you and us and, the people making arguments and trying to. So this, I think the opposition is that. It's the formal opposition is in shambles, and it will take decades for the opposition, for a new political opposition like to emerge. The thing about speed, Irene, yes, what you might be wondering why we were silent, if this was in the drawer of Congress from February. Well, very easy to answer, because everything believed that this was crazy, and that on the election last June, they wouldn't get the majorities and the overrepresentation that they got. And after June, everybody said, okay, Claudia Sheinbaum, the president-elect, will stop this craziness. This won't happen. It's not possible that a lame duck president, López Obrador, in 2 months before leaving office, will try to pass this. This will not happen in Mexico. So it turned out we were wrong, right? And so this is why, in the end, yes, everything happened in 2 weeks, and as you say, Irene, with this intensity that we couldn't really anticipate, no? And I think this is distinctive. And Yaniv, the supranational, yes, for sure. Already the Inter-American Commission has reacted, and the judges have asked for precautionary measures. All this is true, but what is more horrible of all this is that Morena can change the entire constitution. The entire. So even the article that says that treaties are binding in Mexico, they can exit the Inter-American system tomorrow. This is the problem, that it can even be worse. They can really replace not only the entire judiciary, which is probably, yes, something very structural, as Jaime says. They can vote, they can replace the entire constitution without, of course, summoning a constituent assembly. So the supranational is there, but who knows until when? if it's, so I'm sorry to end in this very pessimistic note, but this is the situation.
Okay, I am going to try to answer Isi, Ori, and Irene's question very quickly. So Isi and Ori, I think your questions actually speak to each other. And first of all, I agree. So to answer this question, I agree that with Yaniv that the court should strike down the amendment, and I think it's legally possible, but again, the question is more political, and what would happen if the court would be willing to do so. If in the case that the court, in my view, if it decides to strike down the amendment, the short answer is that nothing will happen. In that, I don't think that the president, and the government would, suddenly decide to abide by, the rule of law and the decision of the court. So it will be, very likely. I don't think it's crazy to say that they will just ignore it. If anything, I think that it will give the government and Morena more ammunition to keep attacking the judiciary and to keep justifying the need for the amendment. So to basically to justify themselves. And this actually fits into Ori's question regarding if there is anything, positive about the amendment. So I honestly honestly, I don't see, like, I don't think that that an argument can be made to justify, really genuinely justify this particular amendment in the terms that it was proposed and passed. But the government justified it basically very quickly, based in as a measure to end nepotism, as a measure to secure, or to make the judiciary like a truly independent power. And I don't know if and to, like, as a measure, as Micaela said, and I think also Chisca said, as a measure to bring the judiciary closer to the people. This was, so basically these talking points, so to say, were used to, you were weaponized in a way to, like, every time that the Supreme Court decided against the government's agenda, these talking points, the Supreme Court being full of nepotism and being corrupt and being wedded with the economic power, was always like in a talking point, specifically by the president every morning in his a daily press conference, because he has this like very unique sort of like communication strategy that he basically has a daily press conference every day, and basically he sets the agenda every single day. He has set the agenda every single day in the last 6 years. And one very important point in that agenda has been attacking the judiciary and delegitimizing the judiciary. So again, to make a point, to refer to one of the points that Chisca said at the beginning of her presentation, this actually, is a result of a pattern that was present every, if not every single day, like every other week, or every few days, in the national debate, because the president kept attacking the judiciary. But in any case, I hope that I'm answering your questions. But in any case, regardless of what the court says, should the court becomes involved in this, which is likely to become involved, whether it strikes down the amendment or not, this will be the step to to the hurdle that will be the last hurdle to actually try to reach the international arena, right? To try to reach the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. What happens if the Inter-American Court of Human Rights says that this amendment is against the convention of the Inter-American Convention of Human Rights? As Chisca just referred to, it's not crazy to think that it will be ignored. And they will move on with the amendment. So yeah, and Irene, how the opposition should be structured. Again, I agree with Chisca. The opposition is morally bankrupt. Honestly, there's nothing there. And I think that we should think about the new generations, new leadership. The opposition is in the streets, not in the ruling elite. So that would be.
Jaime.
El micrófono, Jaime. No te escuchamos.
Perdone. I would like to answer Masom's question that I don't know how to address it, because we don't even know how they will implement the electoral process for that extraordinary election in June 2025, and then the next part in June 2027, Masom. At least I can tell you that there are a series of flaws in the expected procedure for the election, because, for example, as Chisca was explaining, it comprises not only the election of federal judges, but also local judges in each state. So when you are before the ballot, you have to choose, for example, in the case of federal judges, from a list of around 500 to 900 potential, or 500 to 900 candidates. So, and the you will laugh with this, but it is true what I am saying. You will not cross the ballot, but rather from the list that will be provided in it, you will have to write down the name of the candidate. So the absurdity of this is that they are considering that Mexico is comprised by a population with 100% of literacy. That is absurd. Just imagine indigenous communities or rural communities in which people are not able to write down even their names, to write down the name of the candidate for a judge. So again, this is just an illustration of how inadequate this reform is. I see in the audience our dear friend and colleague Julio Rios Figueroa, and I have heard Julio saying two basic things on this. This reform was unnecessary as presented, and it is ill done in terms of how it is articulated. For sure, and answering Ori's inquiry earlier, there are a lot of things to change and to refine of the judicial administration in Mexico. But the point is that they just focused on the federal judiciary that apparently is the less problematic of the whole picture. They don't do anything with the attorney's office, both locally and federally speaking, with the public Ministerio Público or our police enforcement. All those agencies are untouched by this amendment, and those are the sources, the main sources of corruption. So that shows that this was completely politically driven and with a very retributionist approach in terms of the governing coalition trying to get vindicated from the strikes that it received from their legislation over the last 6 years. I would like to underscore something very important. It seems that we are completely lost, and I am reluctant to accept that reading of facts. And in that respect, I think there is a lot to learn from the experience of our friends in Israel, because at some point, I think you felt exactly the same. And I really trust that social mobilization will make, even within the ranks of the governing coalition, to bring some moderates to the side of reason, to change a bit of what is going on at the moment, because otherwise we are in a checkmate situation. And once again, thank you, Yaniv, thank you, Tamar, and Micaela, for bringing us together. Thank you very much.
Wow, fascinating and difficult webinar. Thank you all very much for taking part and for sharing with us your knowledge and your concerns and your experience. I also want to thank Noah Kavat Avraham from the Israeli branch of IberICOnnect that helped us put this thing together. And I think we all three of us, all of us actually in Israel, want to stress that there are a lot of similarities. We really do identify, I identify ourselves in a lot of the things that you're saying. And as a community where we support you, and also if we can assist in any way, if we can share from our experiences what worked, what not worked, you need to be very careful in the comparative context. But I think still, we have some mileage as in this type of struggles, also in the way in which legal academia organized in Israel to coordinate and to work together in face of what was going on. And then I think it would be great to continue on the conversation and the engagement, and to an extent that we can be of any assistance, of course we will be very, very happy to be. So thank you all, and to be continued. We'll continue to speak some more.
Thank you everyone, and thank you Tamar and Yaniv and Juanma, and also Micaela in representation on IberICOnnect for organizing. Yeah, it's really appreciated.
Thank you very much, everyone. Good luck
Thank you
in
so
your
much.
justified struggle.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janif, Maria.